Hey everyone, it's Jacqueline for Pixie Dust PhD. Today we will be making the Jack Jack Num Nums cookie recipe courtesy of Pixar that they posted to social media in March. We will begin this recipe with the wet ingredients. I prefer to use weight measurements, so things in grams, as opposed to volume measurements like cups. Here I did my best estimate. The 2 sticks of butter remains the same, and then I have 250 grams of brown sugar as well as 55 grams of white sugar. Then we have 2 eggs for 1 egg plus 1 yolk, and we will use 1 teaspoon of vanilla. The first step Pixar tells us to do is to brown the butter and let it cool until it begins to solidify. The weight in grams of 2 sticks of butter is going to be different than the weight of that butter when it's browned because you are losing water during this process. Many recipes that utilize browned butter in baking will have you add a little bit of liquid back in, be that water, milk, or similar. The Pixar recipe didn't denote anything about this, so I'm going to assume that they are fine with just using 2 sticks of butter, browning that butter, and then using that remaining amount. Browning butter doesn't take quite that long, but letting it solidify again can take a while, so ideally you will do this step in advance. Here we have our 2 sticks of butter. I'm going to prepare them for browning by slicing them up. Once that's complete, move all of your butter into a saucepan. Ideally, you will use a larger saucepan than this, but I was working with what I had. Then move the saucepan to the stove and melt the butter. Continue on medium heat. You'll notice some vigorous bubbling. Here you're losing some water content and the milk fats are also browning. This is what creates that beautiful, nutty brown butter taste. You'll want to be stirring close to constantly to keep an eye on your brown butter. There is a very fine line between brown butter and burnt butter. So here I felt like I was done and you can see a dramatic change in color. I'm moving it to a separate container to ensure it doesn't continue cooking in the residual heat of the pot. And you'll note that those toasted milk fat solids are going to sink to the bottom. That's completely natural. While we wait for this to solidify, I'm going to move on to the other steps. So we have our 2 eggs for 1 egg plus 1 yolk. I am not great at separating eggs, so I like to do this over 2 bowls. You can see in this first egg that I pierced the yolk a little bit, so I went ahead and called that my single egg. Thankfully, I did a better job in my second egg attempt, so I went ahead and separated the white into my second bowl and then added the yolk into my first bowl. So that is a bowl with 1 egg and 1 yolk now. Go ahead and save this white. I always add the vanilla into my egg mixture, don't ask me why. And here I realized that my first bottle of vanilla was running out, which is why you see 2 bottles. So into the eggs goes 1 teaspoon of vanilla and I just mix. Now while you're still waiting for your brown butter to solidify is a great time to use that egg white. May I suggest a gin fizz? My partner whipped up 2 gin fizzes for us, and you can see the addition of that egg white gives it that beautiful foamy top. Cheers! On to our dry ingredients. Again, I've done my best to convert these into grams. So I have 270 grams of flour that I've sifted, and then we'll use 1 teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. You can use whatever kind of salt you have. I just happen to have this fancy pink Himalayan salt, so I'm going to use that. Add the salt and baking soda to your flour and whisk together. Now our melted brown butter has solidified significantly. During this process, I was stirring occasionally to make sure all of those toasted milk fat bits got well incorporated into the butter. You definitely want to include these delicious brown bits in your recipe. So now we have all of our wet ingredients ready to go. First, we need to cream the butter and the sugars together. Pixar calls for adding salt, but I always personally do this with my dry ingredients. So in my stand mixer goes the brown sugar and the white sugar as well as all of that beautiful brown butter. And you're going to mix until it's creamed on a medium speed. This will take several minutes. Try not to undermix it. You'll note that the consistency gets lighter and fluffier. Next, you'll add your eggs and vanilla. Mine are already pre-mixed. When recipes call for multiple eggs, it's always best practice to add eggs 1 at a time. So here you can see me slowly streaming my eggs in. Now it's time to add the dry ingredients. I always do this in batches, typically in 3s. So I'll add about 1/3 of the dry mixture in and then mix to incorporate, scrape down the bowl, add the second third, mix to incorporate, scrape down the bowl, and then finally add my last bit of dry ingredients and mix. This time I'm not going to mix until everything's fully incorporated because I know we have one more mixture step coming. Lastly is our chocolate chips. The recipe calls for 1 cup, so I'm going to use 175 grams total. I typically mix types of chocolate chips in order to get slightly different flavors throughout the cookie. In this case, I did 100 grams of semi-sweet chips and then 75 grams of 60% cacao bittersweet chips. And we'll add all of those chips into the batter and mix. Then scrape down your bowl and spatula and we are ready to go. That's your final dough. These cookies need to be chilled for at least an hour. I've lined a large Tupperware with wax paper and I am scooping out my cookies into this container with an ice cream scoop. I find for a lot of cookies, the longer you let the flavors meld, the better they turn out, so I chilled these overnight. The next day for baking, I prep my baking sheets with parchment paper and space out the cookies generously. These will spread, so don't put them too close together or you'll end up with one giant cookie. Then we'll bake these at 350 degrees for about 10 minutes. All ovens run a little bit differently though, so if yours runs a little bit low, you'll have to go a little bit longer, and if your oven runs a little bit hot, you will cook for the shorter amount of time. At the halfway mark, I'm going to rotate my cookies. So the side of the pan that's in the back of the oven will now be rotated so that that side's in the front of the oven, and I'm also going to rotate the pans on the rack. So the cookies on the top rack will now go in the middle rack and vice versa. Let the cookies cool on their pans on a cooling sheet for a few minutes. Then move them with a spatula onto the cooling sheet. And here's your final product. It's a super soft and chewy, wonderful chocolate chip cookie. I personally think that this recipe could handle more chocolate chips, so I would definitely add more than 1 cup next time I make this, but otherwise it's a really lovely recipe. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at PixieDustPhD. What changes would you make to this recipe? Or do you prefer the Jack Jack Num Num cookies exactly as they are? I hope you're having a magical day, and we'll see you next time at PixieDustPhD.